No, you guys aren't listening to me. There's a real threat here, and the whole world's ignoring it. Artificial intelligence is taking over our homes, and it's starting from the driveway. There's a crossover in every one. It's brainwashing, and that's how they're doing it. They're luring us in with a false sense of utility, using words like subcompact. Who suspects a crossover? But that's where it starts, and before you know it, they're in your microwaves, and then you're in your TVs. Why am I the only one that can see this?
Get the pizza.
All I'm saying is, think about getting a hatchback, okay? The whole world should think about getting a hatchback. Even the new Mazda 3 has all-wheel drive now. What's up, buddy?
You ready to save the world?
Yes.
Honda Civic Hatchback versus Toyota Corolla Hatchback. Fight!
Ow!
This is the Honda Civic Sport Touring, a fully loaded Civic hatchback to go up against a fully loaded Corolla hatchback. Now, unfortunately, this is a 2018 because we couldn't get our hands on a 2019 yet, but we really wanted to help you all make a good buying decision. And thankfully, the only real difference for the hatchback in 2019 is that it now has a volume knob. Thank God. But either way, here it is. With an automatic transmission and a peppy engine, the Civic continues to be king, selling better than any other car. It seems to be untouchable. Or is it?
Enter the all-new Corolla hatchback. Since the dawn of time, the Corolla has been synonymous with practical, reliable, and a bit boring. But boring no more. That all changes with the new hatchback. Or does it? Seen here in the XSE trim, the 2019 Corolla is finally something to look at. But is it the whole package? And more importantly, can it knock the Civic off its perch? First, let's have a look at some features.
Toyota Corolla hatchback.
Honda Civic Sport Touring.
Naturally aspirated.
Turbocharged.
CVT.
CVT transmission.
168 horsepower.
180 horsepower.
Apple CarPlay. And no Android Auto.
Apple CarPlay and Android Auto.
Front wheel drive.
Front wheel drive.
So the Corolla hatchback is equipped with 168 horsepower naturally aspirated engine. Doesn't sound like much, because it's not. And it's not turbo either like the Civic is, and I kind of wish it was, because it's not fast. In fact, peak torque comes on at 4,800 RPM, so even lower down it doesn't have nearly as much get up and go as the Civic does. Okay. Yeah, it doesn't really move, and that front wheel drive definitely doesn't help it in the winter.
All right, what's the Civic like to drive? This is a turbocharged engine, which means it has more power than that Corolla. And to be perfectly honest, it really does get up and go quite effectively. It has an open differential in the front, so it does spin a wheel, and the traction control lights up if you are in the wet. But it really does huck itself off the line very effectively. I actually really like the way this car pulls away. It feels aggressive. And it does 0 to 60 in under 7 seconds.
But this thing has a rear deck spoiler, and side skirts, and a sport button. It looks sporty. Shouldn't it be sporty? Well, I'm going to get to that a little bit later. But let's start with the gearbox. Like the Civic, it has a CVT. And people tend to judge CVTs by their ability to emulate gears. I judge a good gearbox by its ability to read the input of the pedal and understand what I want to do. And in that sense, this does that very well. I don't need to feel like I've shifted from second to third gear to think that this is a good gearbox. So it wins some points there.
All right, it has a CVT transmission, which actually isn't that bad of a thing, because if you've ever driven the manual Civic, the clutch isn't very good, and there's quite a lot of rev hang. If you are getting a Civic and not getting an SI or a Type R, get the CVT, because it does a pretty good job of simulating gear ratios, and it kind of complements the engine in a very effective way. There is a little bit of lag in the turbocharged engine, so the CVT will just put it right up where it needs to be and get it right in the power band right away. and it doesn't drone in any way, which I actually really do like. Now, there is a sport mode-ish, which makes it go to a lower ratio a little bit quicker, and I have paddles that I can click on my steering wheel, which do things. But you see that there's no hard shift point. The new Kia Forte has really good obvious shift points in its CVT. This doesn't really, and you can like downshift into first gear at whatever speed, and it doesn't hold the revs high for you, even in the sport mode setting. So not a huge fan of using the paddle shifters in this car. That's not what this car is about. Just put it in automatic mode and just let it do everything for you, because it does actually quite a good job.
Steering in this car is crazy light, crazy light. You can easily steer this with just your pinky finger if you wanted to. Don't recommend it, but you could. It's quite possibly the lightest steering I've ever experienced in a car. In fact, the only thing lighter than this is the cheap little Toyota key that you get with this car. And it feels so cheap. It has to be, it's a weird thing to mention, but it's so plastic and cheap. But in an enthusiast world, and especially according to people like Thomas, light steering is often seen as a very negative thing. And I think for the use and the purpose of this car, that is not the case. In fact, this makes the car so easy to live with. The only thing I would worry about with the steering being as light as it is like an astronaut losing muscle density over time. But if you can live with that and make it up elsewhere at home, however you need to make muscle density up in your arms, then I think light steering on something like a Corolla makes a lot of sense.
Now, here is the ace in the hole for the Civic, and the reason that I chose it in this test today is because that Corolla has very light steering. This Civic does not. In fact, the steering of this reminds me of the SI and the Type R. They're not that far off. The Type R is a lot heavier, don't get me wrong, and the front end's a lot more accurate, but the steering in this has a really positive on-center feel, and it still has quite a fast rack. It has a pretty fast steering ratio. So when I come up to a backcountry corner like this, I put the car in and there's obvious weight in those front wheels. It's really confidence inspiring in a car that is not meant to be something to have fun on a back road with. I like driving the Civic. It's just a fun car to drive.
The suspension, also so easy to live with. And I think that is the theme of this car. The damping on this, I've been roaring into Tim Hortons drive-thrus like a menace. This thing takes bumps so well. And if you have passengers in your car, it's not a harsh ride. You're not going to be apologizing to them. It's quite the opposite. Very, very comfortable passenger car.
All right, the suspension in the Civic, I'll be honest, is a little bit stiff. It kind of impacts over bumps. The initial bump damp on the suspension setup in this car is pretty sharp. It almost would benefit from a smaller diameter wheel to kind of take the edge off of the way that it goes over bumps. It stays fairly composed on a back road, and there's really good body control, but not enough that I'm willing to sacrifice a nice soft ride. That's kind of how I see it. In a car like this, I don't want it to be stiff. I want it to be comfortable because I'm commuting in it every single day. Now, the interior is very comfortable. The suspension might not be, but the interior, where I'm sitting, everything here is well done. I like the driving position of the Civic. I can get the seat very low, actually, and get a really nice, comfortable driving position. The steering wheel doesn't come at me as much as I would want, but it is adequate, and I'm not going to complain really about it at all. The seats are quite comfortable. In the Sport Touring, you get these leather seats, and I think that it really brings up the interior quite substantially. I know we don't all like leather, but I actually like leather. You have heated seats to take the edge off in the winter, and to be perfectly honest, I like the look of leather. I think it feels a lot more premium, and these seats are well done. There's kind of like some fake carbon fiber-ish leather strip running up the center, which isn't exactly cool, but for the most part, the interior looks and feels well made.
I'm super impressed with the interior. This seat behind me is very comfortable. It's even kind of got like a racing style to it, which is really nice. It keeps you nicely centered, and it's very comfortable. Thomas will boast that the Civic has all leather seats and therefore it's superior. I disagree. This one has the cloth inserts within the leather, and I love cloth. And these are heated seats as well, which you don't normally associate with cloth, but it means it's not freezing cold on a cold day like leather is, and it's not boiling hot on a hot day. So for me, cloth inserts is a perfect combination, and this has that. As far as materials are concerned in the interior, these are quite soft materials. Everything feels premium, more premium than you would expect at this price range. And I know, you know, under 30 grand still doesn't sound super cheap, but in the reality of today, that is a cheap car. And we can take it up with the automakers another time with our protests. But that is a low price for a car of this quality. Also, this is the XSE version, so I get the leather-wrapped steering wheel, which I know the Civic also has, but it's a nice luxury when you have it. And for the musically inclined, it seems as though Toyota have teamed up with Steinman & Sons pianos, because in the center here, if you turn to your right, there's an entire bloody piano. Piano black as far as the eye can see, which means you can see every single mark. I don't know why they've done that. At least they haven't done that on the steering wheel, because that would be a nightmare. Speaking of the steering wheel, there's paddle shifters, which I think, like the sport button, no one is ever going to use. In fact, the sport button and the paddle shifters are very much like sticking a sock down your trousers and pretending to be something you're not. When it comes down to it, it doesn't work. But don't let that take away from the fact that I'm actually a huge fan of this car. It is a breeze to drive on the highway, in the city. It's economical. I'm averaging 6.3 litres per 100 kilometers right now, which in American speak is this.
The visibility is actually very good, and even though I kind of have like a split rear window, there's still a good amount of space looking out the back. I don't know what James's Corolla is like, as I haven't actually looked in the rearview mirror of that car yet, but this has good enough space, and my mirrors are huge. I also have that blind spot monitoring detector, which I can turn on with a button on my steering stalk here, and it appears on my screen. The problem with that is that unless you go in the menu and turn it off ahead of time, when you put your right turn signal on, it will turn on and show you what's in your blind spot. And I don't need to see what's in my blind spot. I need to see what's on my GPS to make sure that I turn at the right place in downtown Toronto. So that is a little bit of an issue. You can turn it off, but I kind of wish that it was in a different, it should appear in this screen over here.
It comes with adaptive cruise control, which Toyota calls radar cruise control. It comes with lane assist and blind spot detection and everything else you can imagine. Unfortunately, and this is where Toyota, who have really disappointed me, this thing is not able to come with a sunroof, and the Civic does have one. You'd have to get the sedan to get a sunroof, and I think that's a tragedy. That's not the only negative, although this one is not such a big deal. The gauge cluster in the middle is very retro, very in not such a nice way. It has all the information you need. It looks like it was made in the same generation as Pac-Man, and that's not what I want while I'm driving my car. Also, I'm terrible at Pac-Man. It's a very stressful game for me and everyone else involved. But yes, I think this could do with a bit of updating. But then that is, again, where you have to forgive Toyota. It's not uncommon that their technology is a generation behind, because they spend such an inordinate amount on quality control that their focus goes elsewhere, and you know that everything is going to work. It might not be the most up-to-date system, but it will work. This thing is going to live longer than your grandma. And I can also perfectly see how economical my new Corolla's being, and that is enough information for me.
Now, as I said, I'm not going to go really in-depth in the infotainment at all, because it has been updated for 2019 now with a volume knob. And what I need to do is, since I had so many issues with the previous year's infotainment, I need to sit down with that and do a really long assessment. That will probably be in a video with maybe the 2019 Type R, the 2019 SI, or something like that. But for right now, all you need to know is that it's fine if you get used to the volume slider in 2018, but make sure you get a 2019 because it has a volume knob. And honestly, I know a lot of you complain and say that that doesn't actually matter that much. It does. Years and years and years of training my brain to use a volume knob means that I will reach for one forever. I don't think I could ever relearn volume control to be a poke slider. This gauge cluster is fantastic. I've always loved it. I think it is excellent and central and crisp and clear. The graphics look fantastic, and I've got two green lights up at the top that tell me if I'm driving economically or not. If I put my foot down even more, they turn white. They don't turn red, because red would be sport, but they turn white to say like, ooh, you're not driving so economically anymore. I can turn my econ button on, which holds the revs back even more. It shows me my fuel economy in the center screen as well. I toggle over using this button. And as of right now, mostly city driving, I'm getting 8.3 liters per 100 kilometers. I will float the miles per gallon around somewhere in the sky. I don't know if that would improve that much by more high weight, I believe that it does. I don't want to comment because I can't remember, but I think it goes down to 6s or 7s if you do a lot of high weight driving. Either way, for the amount of power that I have and the way that it takes off, I'm happy with that fuel economy, no question.
And on top of good visibility, the seats in the back are actually quite comfortable, and I have enough headroom. I'm 5'10". I got enough headroom, although legroom leaves a little bit to be desired. I did sit in the Civic, and it is slightly more spacious. So if that's a big concern, then think about that. Also, the Civic's rear seats have heated seats. These ones don't. So if you hate your kids, buy a Corolla. If you're reasonably fond of them, consider a Civic. One aesthetic complaint for the interior is that this infotainment system comes up a little bit high in my face, and I don't like it. It's getting all up in my face, and it could be a little bit lower or some sort of stowaway system, but it's just something that means it's not all there. But at least there's hard buttons. I appreciate the fact that there's hard buttons while I drive. It's not all a touchscreen. And it has Apple CarPlay, which, even though it doesn't default to when I start the car up, is still a very welcome addition. So it looks sporty, it's got a compliant gearbox, it's got a comfortable seating position. What is the new Corolla? And I think the answer is the perfect Corolla. It's not the best car I've ever been in, but it's the best Corolla I've ever been in, and this thing nails the Corolla badge. It is absolutely perfect. I think this car provides too good of an argument against something like the Civic to not be considered strongly. And you can nitpick, you can always nitpick. Yes, the seating position's a little bit too high. It doesn't go any lower than the way I'm sitting right now. And the styling suggests a sportiness that really, really, really isn't there. You know, the 0 to 100 in this is like 100 kilometers an hour is 8.5 to 9 seconds-ish. And I have no reason to not believe that. When I put my foot down, not much happens at all. But I think Toyota have really done themselves a service by creating a good-looking, better looking than the Civic. I know that's subjective, but stylistically, this thing is a lot more modern looking and a lot cleaner. I think there's some issues with the Civic that need addressing, and don't even get me started on the fake vents. Although, to be fair, this thing's fake exhaust tips kind of look like someone's attempt to make fake versions of fake tips. They look ridiculous, and I wish Toyota hadn't done them. So everyone's guilty of trying to be something they're not, I guess. But I'm going to quickly jump into the Civic, and I'm going to remind myself again why these things are such close competitors, because Honda and Toyota sell a million, bajillion, zillion of these things, and mostly in the CVT format. This is a CVT, that's a CVT, so let's find out. Okay, I'm in the Civic. Immediately a much lower driving position, immediately much heavier steering, immediately a sunroof. Those are the three things that jump out at you like crazy.
All right, 2019 Corolla. Let's see what all the fuss is about. It's not as fast. Yeah, no, not even close. Civic's got so much more torque than this.
In a weird way, there's a relief to both cars' steering. You know, you get out of the Corolla and it's been super light, and this is welcomingly heavy and direct. And taking this round corners, it's definitely more flat. It feels a lot more confident throwing this into a corner at speed than the Corolla does. So that is a very important thing. And it's also a little bit more fun in those corners for that same reason.
This makes its peak torque way up in the rev range, which normally I don't care about. I like naturally aspirated power bands, but I want it to have 400 horsepower, not 100 and whatever it has. It has a heated steering wheel though. It's really warm and toasty. Mine doesn't have that.
Yeah, there's so much more power in this thing. So much more power in this thing. It's very similar to the SI Coupe I was in recently. It's amazing how the power difference between the SI and this isn't that far apart. And I'm in eco mode. It's showing leaves right now. I'm pretty sure that means that every time I put my foot down, they plant a tree for you. I don't know how they measure that. It's pretty impressive by Honda. Also potentially very untrue.
The steering in the Corolla is way too light. There's no real obvious on-center feel, although when I put a little bit of weight into the corner, I can feel some in the steering, but not nearly as much as the Civic. The Civic does like the driving dynamics so much better.
The cabin feels larger. The road noise is actually worse. An enthusiast car, the Corolla is not. This definitely knocks on the door of enthusiast far more strongly than the Corolla. However, you sacrifice a few things. I think the steering is a preference thing, and so in the Civic you sacrifice the light steering just as much as in the Corolla you sacrifice the direct, heavier steering.
The next thing that I've noticed, the biggest difference between these two cars, is that this has a much more comfortable ride. Without a question. The initial damping bump is a lot softer in this car, and that's what you want in a car like this. You can get a sports version of Toyotas, you can get a sports version of a Civic, but these everyday commuter hatchbacks should most definitely have a nice soft ride, and this does.
I also think that this Corolla is much more upmarket on the inside. I think there's a feeling of modernity and class that the Corolla has that this doesn't have. However, this can do this. With a little bit of turbo spool. And yes, you haven't got to wait for the turbo to spool up in the Corolla, but it definitely doesn't do nearly as much. So, you know, take it as it comes.
This definitely feels like a smaller hatchback. I'm doing a pointless slalom on a back road. But you know what? The Civic feels so much sharper. This feels smaller and more playful, but the Civic feels sharper in the front end, and for that reason, I like the driving engagement of the Civic better.
So gun to the head, which car would I pick? I think, given that I live in the city, I would pick the Corolla. I know Thomas is going to pick this because I'm Thomas, I'm a car enthusiast, and it has to be the most enthusiast-oriented car. No, it doesn't. Not for everyone. But I think the Corolla is more livable, and that's the car out of the two I would buy. I certainly would not get it in that bronze oxide, which as far as I'm concerned is just a repackaged version of champagne. And champagne is a colour on a car that should never see the light of day ever again. But the Corolla comes in an epic blue, and I love the blue it comes in, so that would be my pick.
This is arguably a more comfortable car from the driver's perspective, in terms of space, the ride, the seat. I think this is a more comfortable car. The Civic is a more engaging car, and you feel like you are in better control of it, and the extra power doesn't hurt. And I think for that reason, I would take the Civic. This Corolla looks better on the outside, it is more comfortable, but I still personally, if I was gonna buy an everyday hatchback, I still like that engagement in the front end and in the engine, and I like the pickup that it has for just getting onto the highway or passing somebody. I value that, and I think that I would buy a Civic Sport Touring over this Corolla.
So not surprisingly, James and I chose different cars, which really just tells you that they are both so effective at what they do, it comes down to driver preference. So before you go, tell us which one you would buy in the comments, and subscribe for a new review or comparison every week. And don't forget to follow @The Throttle House on Instagram for behind the scenes.
Shut up.
Okay, go ahead.
Nothing's in the shot.
Shut up!
It's zoomed in on my face right now. Even the new Mazda 3 is...
This is weird because I keep opening this up, and the first time I was like, oh.
Thanks, dude. It's only freezing out here. Okay, if I make a
It's
smile.
nice that I'm getting a brief moment of warmth
Can I
every time you
smile?
open.
Can I smile?
You go ahead and smile. Let me do my thing.
Smile. Sit down, Daisy. Sit.